happy Tuesday to you as we are back for episode 21 of The Language of Behavior. My name is Joshua Stamper. I have the talented and phenomenal Charlie Peck with me. Charlie, how's your day going so far?
It's great. I'm so glad to be here with you today. This is awesome. We got a good topic.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's important.
All right, so as we were talking, I kept hearing dings from your computer, and it's pretty exciting because people are signing up for a free webinar here coming up in the month of April 29th, and I've got the link here for everyone. So Charlie, would you share a little bit about this free resource?
Yes, I'm so excited, you guys. Listen, so April 29th, we are doing a 2-hour webinar to showcase what Thriving Educator is doing to support teachers throughout the globe. And it's really for school leaders, including school counselors, administrators, district leaders, and those rock star teacher leaders in your building. That might be you're listening, because you want to improve student success. You want to level up what they're doing, not only academically, but you want to address their behavior concerns because you're overwhelmed and frustrated. So this is for you. And we're going to have guest speakers there who are already utilizing what we're doing and showing how it's helping. So I cannot wait. And of course, Josh, we always give free resources. So we've got some free mental health resources too.
Awesome. Can't wait for this event. And yeah, we're going to have some guests. We're going to have some people from all over the world. I know people are signing up from other countries too. Our reach is not just in the United States, which is phenomenal. We've had, people all over from previous webinars and already signing up. So yes, if you're outside of the United States, feel free to sign up. We'd love to have you. And the list is growing. So make sure you're taking advantage of the Thriving Educator webinar. So the link is on the screen for those who are watching on YouTube. Otherwise, it'll be in the show notes for all of those podcast players. All right, Charlie, we have a long list of questions that we're going to try and get through. Today, we're going to hit on one from our newsletter, some that's been attached to the newsletter and participated in a free giveaway, because sometimes we do that on our newsletters, sending books out, whatnot. So this one comes from a teacher leader, Leah Hobbs. And her question is, how do you recommend integrating social emotional learning to address behaviors in ISS? And then she kind of gives a little caveat as far as when students are being disciplined, for example, dress code violations or too many tardies or other, behaviors like that.
And you want me to start answering this one, don't you? God. Josh, this is so tricky because the question, it's a good question, but here's what I heard you say. I'm going to throw it back to you.
Please.
And I'll answer too, but I want to hear you first. Here's what I heard you say, that those are not reasons why the kid should be in ISS. So let's talk about it. First of all, explain ISS and why we have it and why maybe some of this is not related to why kids should be there.
Yeah, and we touch on this in the book, in The Language of Behavior, and I'm very passionate about this. Obviously, my experience in administration for almost a decade was really focused on student discipline. And for the management side of things, a lot of times what we found was like low-level infractions were being sent to ISS. And when I started to, it didn't matter the campus or the district, when I started to look at the data and start adding up the minutes of instructional loss, it was literally in the thousands. And unfortunately, it was just like repeat offenders for things like having their hoodie up or, dress code violation like that. And, to have a student miss an entire class period of 45 minutes to 90 minutes of instruction, depending on what your master schedule looks like, for me just was knocked me over out of my chair kind of feeling, because it's like, why are we taking such low level pieces and taking them from those who are the content masters here? So, for me, like, that's what kind of was my first thought, was like, for dress code violations and too many tardies, ISS is not going to solve that problem. And the data shows that in-school suspension is really not something that's going to change behavior. And there's plenty of reasons for that. I mean, if someone is lacking a skill, punishing them to have them create that skill is never going to work. And so my question would then be, as far as social emotional learning, how are they getting that outside of ISS? Because ISS is usually not set up for learning. And if you look at most of the settings that students are placed in for anywhere from a one period to an entire day, instruction loss is actually heightened in that environment versus somewhere else. Actually, obviously for the instructional environment, or be in the front office. Sometimes ISS is overflowing. We had that issue early on in my administration experience, and so like going to the front office and they're just sitting there. They don't have any resources. They don't have any instructor. They don't have even an adult really watching them outside of maybe a secretary. And talk about instructional loss there too. So to do social emotional learning in those environments, I think is a detriment to the child. Putting them in ISS for a low level infraction is a detriment to the child. And for us, we had to like revamp our discipline matrix as a whole and figure out, are there strategies that we can help the teachers to address these low level things as far as distraction, disrespect, dress code violation, where they can stay in that environment. And so we've talked about it, I think, on this podcast. Is push-ins was one of those solutions for us to allow the teacher to have that opportunity to be with the student, to address what's going on, but then still allow them to go back into the educational environment where they belong. So that's where the social emotional learning should be taking place. But that's my opinion. Charlie, what about you?
Well, it's good though, and I'm thinking from the questions, like the person who asked the question, Leah's question, because she must be in that environment anyway. Like she must be receiving kids and want to level up what they're doing and
Yeah.
incorporate SEL. And for people who are like, what is SEL? That's that social emotional learning.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like she would want to utilize that space if they have to be there to benefit the kid. So that's how I'm hearing it, which we've got to adjust all of it, right? And
Yeah.
so it goes back to, how do we utilize it then in a way that's going to benefit the kid? Well, we can use it as kind of a coping skills kind of, let's add some coping skills. Well,
Yeah.
what was going on in the classroom for you that was kind of making you feel dysregulated? So we can have a conversation about what feeling emotionally regulated is and what being emotionally dysregulated is, and what happened right before then, or what has been building up to make you get dysregulated. So we normalize kind of what behavior is and relate it back to our nervous system. Well, your nervous system, your body was telling you that something was out of whack, something wasn't sitting right with you. And so I would utilize it as a way to have that conversation to help kids understand what's going on in their brain and their bodies. So I would do that. And then how do we cope? So one of the things we have as a tool that's called this coping skills planner. And so it's a 3-page document. I use it in my practice all the time. And I have kids put in there like what kind of triggered that, or what made you feel dysregulated, and what was that like for you? How did it show up for you? Did your chest tighten up? Did you clench your fist? Did your jaw tighten up? Did your face feel red? All of those things are signs from our nervous system that something doesn't feel right, that I'm getting to the level of dysregulation. And so once they learn to notice that, then on their coping skills planner, they can write, well, when this happens, this is what I can do to cope. I can try to do box breathing. And then if they don't know what that is, guess what? You can teach that skill. Or if they're saying, I just want to put my head down, well, maybe that's a conversation we have with the teacher. Because we've said this before, Josh. A lot of kids that I work with as a therapist at school, a lot of those kids are saying, I put my head down because it makes me feel better when the teacher is too loud, or when kids are bothering me, the noise level is too loud, I can't focus or concentrate. So it's a little escape for them. So instead of them leaving your classroom, which you don't often want them doing, they're putting their head down for the same kind of feedback that their body is needing. Now, teachers just need to understand that there's communication that the kid needs and that the teacher needs to have that understanding, so the kid isn't always putting their head down, because teachers will first say, of course, well, they're just taking advantage of it. Well, some might try, but also if they're not engaging, what's going on there? So I would use it that way. And then also we can use it if the kids are there anyway, use it as that kind of relationship repair space, teach them some of those restorative practices. And you don't have to think too much about it. You don't have to be trained in restorative practice, which, by the way, is great training. But you can just ask them simple questions like, what harm did you cause to yourself here? Like, what happened? And how did that influence you? How did that influence other students and their learning? And how did that influence the teacher? So we could frame it that way and have them think about it. Or you could say, like, how can I then repair that? Like what I did? Because often kids don't they feel bad. They don't want that stuff to happen. And certainly if it's happening over and over, they want to restore that. So how do I restore trust? So these are conversations. These are just simple questions you can ask them. Use that space to help them rethink it and reframe it. And then also you can ask them like, who needs to hear from me after this? When I go back in preparation so that I don't have to come back to this space, who needs to hear from me? Who needs to hear what I have to say? So those are just some questions we can facilitate
Yep.
for kids. Yeah.
Well, and we revamped, and this is, Charlie, the work that we do too when we work with schools, is just that the ISS setting just needs to be redone altogether, typically. Because in a traditional model, it's just a room where kids are just sent, and there's one person that mans it, or maybe it's a rotation that's manned every period by a different person, which makes that even harder for consistency purposes. So like for us is like we created a social emotional room where it was exactly what you're talking about, right? Teaching the emotional regulation strategies, getting kids to settle down, get ready to go back into the educational environment where it wasn't really punitive at all. It was more about teaching and getting yourself ready to be able to be in that learning environment. But then the secondary piece of like having a space for restorative circles, and then having the people that are trained and know what to do and asking those questions. And sometimes, based on, because we all know, right, resources are lacking, and bodies are everywhere, as far as staff goes. So sometimes we had like a whole team of folks, and even with a student that maybe was waiting, they actually had, similar to what you were talking about, like a worksheet for them to work through, as far as allowing them to take ownership of what occurred, as far as their part in the negative behavior. And then what you were saying too, as far as like who did it affect, because a lot of times our kids are only thinking about the one kid that maybe they pushed in the hallway. That's the only person that was affected. Well, no, there's a lot more than that, right? And then having them kind of work through like that restoration piece of like what needs to happen next, to restore either a relationship, or maybe it was something that they broke, like an item. And so having them think through that and work through that prior to actually getting to it with an adult that actually had the conversation. And that was where the teaching piece came in, right? To allow us to go through each of the questions, because a lot of times our students have never gone through a restorative circle before, or they don't know the process. Maybe these are questions they've never even thought of after having a negative behavior. And so helping them through that process with an adult and that teach piece. And the main thing is to make sure that they have the skills for when this occurs again in the future to make the appropriate decision versus what they had done in that situation.
Yeah. You know, it's really a shift in thinking about what we're utilizing the space for. So as you're
Yeah.
talking about that, Josh, I was thinking the labeling of it is so important. Imagine if you're going to the SEL room, the self regulation room, as opposed to the in-school suspension room. I mean, just think of the connotation there for each one. So I wonder if we're trying to move away from punitive approaches, which we are because it's just not working, how do we guide or facilitate behavior? How do we use those spaces to facilitate and guide the behavior? Because we also have to protect the teacher, right? If something's going on with the kid and they're disrupting the learning environment, that's not okay either. And we can use things like the push-in model to keep the kid there. We can have those great strategies that we use when we work with those relationship action teams to help them. But there are times where it makes sense for the kid not to be in the space,
Yes.
even for a short period of time, correct?
Yep. For
Yeah.
sure.
And so I do want to validate that for teachers. You and I are always looking out, of course, for the kids and the kids' needs, but we're also looking out for the reality of what's going on in the education space.
Yep.
But we are trying to protect the teachers' needs as well. And so, how do we keep them connected? We really want to get back to
Mhm.
how do we keep them connected? And that is the communication. So, and the validation of what's going on. But I think these are all really important, and maybe kind of how we label the ISS room. Maybe we call it something different
Yeah.
and incorporate that regulation piece into instead of suspension. But I will ask you this because this is where your lens will come in as an administrator. Is there something legally around that where it has to be an in-school suspension so it's part of their record, or is that a part of it? I don't know.
Well, and I always talk about just the permission of our leaders, as far as you have more power than you realize. So, yes, there are codes that you have to abide by, and there's definitely, at the end of the year, you have to submit your discipline records to the district, to the state.
Yeah.
And of course, if there's special education labels to the student, obviously those records have to be very well done and documented as far as if that student is being removed from the educational environment. So yes, there's definitely legal pieces to that, but at the same time, like we're talking low level, right? I mean, based on what Leah had put in the question as far as dress code violations, whatnot, we're talking low level. Now, of course, like if a student's in a fight, or I mean, I've seen it all as far as drugs, gang fights, the whole nine yards, weapons. Like obviously, there's another tier, a much higher tier, where that's not a student going back to class. That's you still need a place for that student for such a high behavior. And of course, there's additional resources that need to be addressed with that student. But for low level, I think ISS is just not the space for that student. And that's why we are trying to be creative and building additional spaces and environments for our kids to go, because if they're going to ISS, most likely the ISS clerk or whatever you want to call that position is not set up for their emotional and academic needs. And so where else can that student go, especially if it's something that they just need 10, 15 minutes to cool down, to get themselves right, and then to go back to class, and knowing that expectation before even entering that space. And that was hard for our staff to wrap their head around. They had never experienced anything like that. And so there were a lot of mistakes at the very beginning of the year of like where to send the kid, and kids ended up in the wrong areas that they didn't belong in. So we had to kind of like smooth that out. But over time, I think we saw a benefit, both not only on the discipline records, but then also just like you said, for the kid. Like if I know I'm going into the social emotional room or whatever you want to call it, I know I'm not in trouble. I know that that's a space for me to get myself right, versus I'm being punished, I'm being kicked out, and I'm being held. And my kids have even said this, my students, of I feel like a prisoner, like I feel like I'm going to jail, and that's not the place, the feeling, the emotion that we want to correlate to school ever. So like, how do we break those walls down?
Well, and I think, as you're saying that, I think there are teachers who think they should have that feeling. Like if they're doing something really disruptive and aggressive in the classroom, I think and this is what I'm hearing
Hmm.
from teachers, and so this needs to be addressed too. If they're really aggressive, threatening the teacher, it's really something that society would not accept. Should, and I don't know, I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm going to throw it back to you too. Should that ISS room feel like a space that kids don't want to be in? I mean, how do we do this, Josh? Like, do we need to create that SEL room that kids want to go to, but then will they take advantage of it because they don't want to be in the teacher's room, right? So that's an issue. But also, what do we do with those kids who we need them to understand that society will not accept this behavior? So there's absolutely no way you could be doing this to a teacher and quote unquote get away with it. I know this is an attitude that we talk a lot about. So let's quickly address that here, and it might be a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, I don't think I have enough time to address it.
Yeah.
However, yes, all kids will try and take advantage. If you give an inch, sometimes they take a mile, but it's not the majority. It's a minority group of students. And that's where the consistency of making sure that everybody understands the expectation, the rules, and making sure that a student's not just allowed to go into a space that they don't belong in. And that goes with anything. We had students try to go into other teachers' classrooms and stay in there when they were supposed to be in class. Instead of math class, they ended up in, an art classroom, or ended up in a PE class or whatever. And it's like, obviously, those expectations need to be clear, and you need to make sure that there's consequences that abide by that. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be consequences for our students. Now, the high level pieces, yeah, I mean, I understand that, there should be a punishment, there should be a consequence. And, depending on your district and how large and the resources that you're providing, I mean, there might be alternative settings for them, right? I know, there are a lot of districts that have other buildings for severe behaviors. And I'm all for that. The main piece is like, we need to make sure that they're learning. And if a student is feeling like I'm going to jail and I don't want to get off the bus to go into the space because I know that that's how I'm going to be treated as an inmate, I don't know about you, but I don't think I'd ever want to go into a space like that. I mean, I got disciplined as a student, and I hated school. I literally had to be drugged into the building. I can tell you that there were a lot of days there wasn't learning that was occurring.
Right.
And I just, knowing my experience and knowing the emotions and the feelings that I had growing up, for me, and that's why I got into education, was I never wanted the students to feel that way, because if they're feeling that way before the bell even rings and the day has even started, then what is truly going to happen as far as mastering the skills that we're expecting them to do that? And so that's kind of the basis of the book too, right? Is like to make sure that we're there for the emotional needs of our children prior to even getting to the academic. Yes, the academic is the number one priority for all of our educators, for all of our teachers, for our administrators. But if they're not in the right mental space, if there's something that's lacking, then learning's not going to occur. So those are things we need to address first.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have all that data. We know now, and we know so much about the brain, and actually so little about the brain still too, but we know enough information that we have to engage them emotionally, and they have to have our trust to
Mhm.
want to be there in order for us to get all of those performance, all that performance data that we want
Yeah.
to increase, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
great.
It's not an easy topic by any means. I mean, student discipline, obviously, Charlie, as we navigate through this also, we're trying to find what's the best. But as we also know that every school is different, every student body is different, the needs of the community is different, and then of course the resources that are available to you. And so, Leah, obviously, we love the conversation and the question that you provided. And there's a lot of components to it, and maybe this is something that we can bring up again. But I would really look at, the behavior matrix. I would look at your alternative environments within the school setup. I'd also look at, do you have anything set up for restoration after student behavior? But then also, what does social emotional learning even look like on your campus? And Charlie, maybe that's for a future episode too, as far as what that might look like and what should be successful on a campus too.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So with that, if you have a question and maybe something spawned from what Charlie and I are talking about, you can always head over to bit.ly/LOB questions. This is where you have an opportunity to ask questions to us directly. So that way we can address what's going on your campus, or maybe in your classroom, maybe in your district, because we want to make sure that we're trying to support you the best way possible. And of course, if you're looking for more information in regards to what Charlie's doing, thrivingeducator.org is her website, ton of resources there. And then you can always head over to mine also, joshtamber.com. We both have downloadables. We got the podcast, we've got blogs. I mean, a whole host of things on there for you. So make sure that you're heading over there. And then, of course, we have our webinar coming up that we started the show off with. So if you want to sign up, that's free. And that's coming up here April 29th. So make sure you take advantage of that. Charlie, do we have any closing words for episode 21?
I want to give a shout out to Jonathan Cranford. He's got a great resource for when you do have ISS. He's got a book called The Art of ISS. He's got some really good ideas of how to utilize that space better for kids as a
Yep.
supportive environment. So I would suggest that as a resource. And if your kids are going to ISS and you're already thinking about utilizing SEL better to integrate it, good for you. Try to think of ways that we can use it to guide kids and teach them about how their body and brain are working together.
We really need to have him on as a guest sometime, though. Maybe dive into this a little bit deeper.
Yeah, for sure. We will.
Awesome. All right, y'all. I hope you have a wonderful week. And if you need anything, Charlie and I are here for you. And we hope that everything is going fantastic as the school year is winding down.